What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a slightly more discussion-oriented video, specifically about Arcanum and Microsoft's recent acquisition of Activision Blizzard, as those two things are somewhat related. Now, I've talked about this in a few places here and there. I think the last time I actually spoke about it at any real length, though, was almost 2 years ago, and given that Microsoft just finally closed their acquisition of Activision Blizzard, it felt like a relevant time to bring this up. And while I'm sure a lot of my regular viewers know exactly what I'm talking about, I'm going to try to cover this pretty thoroughly and talk about it from basically all the angles now that it is a real possibility. And that possibility is, of course, a sequel to Arcanum, which admittedly is the only thing I really care about when it comes to this acquisition, at least on a personal level, as pretty much everything else was just unlikely to affect anything in regards to how I play or where I acquire games, but admittedly a pretty big deal to a lot of other people. But let's start at the beginning. What is Arcanum? For starters, if you want more information than this bare bones explanation, I did make a full review for this game. It's a couple years old, but it still covers all the bases that you would need to know even today. So if you want to know more than this, there is a place to find out exactly that. But very quickly, Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, to give it its full name, was an isometric CRPG published by Sierra Online all the way back in 2001. And it's a game that mixed a steampunk setting with a more high fantasy approach to these things. And there was a trade-off between technology and the magic, and how those two forces were at odds with each other, and when thrown out of balance could cause all sorts of real problems. And the game explored a lot of other themes at the intersection of those two ideas. For instance, how high fantasy species might deal with things like labor unions, as one example. But simply put, it was an incredibly unique world. However, like pretty much every game developed by Troika, a now defunct company that made exactly 3 games from 3 very well-known developers, and of course the team that worked for them, and every game they worked on is a sort of cult classic at this point. But nonetheless, the company went under due to financial struggles, as they were pretty much always pressed for time and cash, which meant every game they released, all 3 of them, had some pretty glaring issues, especially in terms of performance, because contrary to popular belief, games releasing as buggy messes is not a new occurrence. And I mention that because Arcanum, for all of its faults, of which there were a few, the progression system in particular is something that is often lambasted as not being particularly well done, and there are also some issues with the combat of the time as well. In spite of those things, however, this 20-year-old game still maintains a bit of a cult following, as it is very good if you can push past those things, which is possible largely due to an unofficial patch, which is essentially required these days to actually run the game on modern hardware. So at this point, Arcanum is a now cult classic CRPG of yesteryear that people still look fondly on, that was published by Sierra Online. And its developer, the 3 well-known developers that headed up that company, known as Troika Games, were Jason Anderson, Leonard Boyarsky, and Tim Kaine, who, after the closing of Troika, went in a few different directions. However, now they all kind of work for Microsoft. 2 of them work for companies owned by Microsoft directly, with Jason Anderson working at In Exile Entertainment, Leonard Boyarsky working for Obsidian Entertainment, and Tim Kaine also working for Obsidian these days, but it is as a contractor. And coincidentally, he also has a YouTube channel where he talks about game development at length, and there's some pretty insightful stuff there, so you'll actually be able to see some of the stuff I'm talking about from the person who did it if you would like as well. And we'll double back around to that. So all the developers who made Arcanum now work at Microsoft in some form or fashion. They don't own the rights to Arcanum, however. After Troika shut down, the rights to Arcanum actually went to its publisher, Sierra. Sierra Online actually went out of business, sort of, in 2008. And I say sort of because they were technically closed as part of a deal for their parent company, Vivendi, to be acquired by Activision Blizzard. And as part of that merger, Sierra specifically was shut down, but sort of absorbed into Activision at the same time, with Activision retaining the rights to everything that Sierra did, which included Arcanum. And this is why, to this day, if you go to Arcanum's Steam page or GOG, Activision is listed as the publisher. Now, if you know literally anything about Activision Blizzard, it would become readily apparent that, frankly, Arcanum isn't exactly their style of game. It was just sort of a byproduct of this acquisition. And while Activision did sell the rights to some of these games that they didn't plan on using from Sierra to other people over the years, though most of that was pretty well wrapped up by 2009, Arcanum did remain with Activision, which put us in a weird situation of Arcanum being this very much loved and sort of, again, cult classic game that the rights holder had no interest in doing anything with, and then they just sat on it. Fast forward quite a bit to 2021, I'm talking about Arcanum in a review, and I mentioned that the only way we would get a sequel or a continuation of any sort to this universe is if, in some crazy scenario, Microsoft wound up purchasing Activision Blizzard, or just buying the rights, something of that nature. And from the time I made that video to the announcement of the merger was like 2 or 3 months, which was humorous, and in this context, it's important because that finally puts all the pieces for a sequel to this game under one roof, so to speak, which is Microsoft. Microsoft now employs the people who you would want making a sequel to this game, and it also owns the rights to said game. And while that's obviously most of the story right there are more things that I want to talk about. Some pros and cons, what would a sequel even look like, etc. Now, I do want to start this portion of the video by saying that even if something like this were to get greenlit, it would be years before we see it. Obviously, work is not in progress, it has not started. So again, even if they're having conversations right now about reviving some of this stuff, it'll be years before we see any of it. Especially considering, and this is probably the biggest detractor to this actually happening, all of those people I just mentioned are working on other things. Tim Kaine is helping with like The Outer Worlds 2 and stuff, which also goes for Leonard Boyarsky. Jason Anderson is with In Exile Entertainment, who are working on their own big game called Clockwork Revolution. And given that Obsidian is working on both The Outer Worlds 2 and Avowed, it would be a while and require a lot of coordination before you could get anything off the ground for this. But in spite of that, we are now closer to the possibility of this happening than literally ever. And the story doesn't end there. Because, believe it or not, there was an Arcanum 2 planned at one point, which means an idea for a sequel is kind of there. Tim Kaine on his YouTube channel outlined a lot of this, so if you'd like to hear it from him, by all means, go do it. Plans were drafted for a sequel, they just never actually got to happen due to, of course, Troika closing down, etc. One of the interesting things about a sequel, though, is that they wanted it to revolve around the discovery of a special ore that would effectively allow magic and technology to potentially coexist, kicking off a sort of resource war, or at least the beginnings of one, over this resource that was an effective solution to all problems, at least in this universe, really. So, in spite of all this time that has passed, etc., there could be an effective pitch to be made to Microsoft, who is, as a matter of fact, actively looking at Activision's IP, wondering what they could and could not work into potential new offerings or reviving old things, brushing them up, etc. And I think that gets even more compelling when you look at the recent success of Baldur's Gate 3, a top-down, not exactly isometric honestly, CRPG that did insanely well, better than just about everything. So if there was ever a time to pitch a game like this to Microsoft with a recently acquired IP that they could also revive, now would be the time to do it. And while obviously nothing is set in stone until it is, of course, I'm just saying that if I was a developer and I wanted to pursue this, now is when you'd be trying to make that pitch. But, of course, as I mentioned, all these people are busy, they're working on other games, so I don't know if that enthusiasm is there, and I certainly don't want to sound like I'm speaking for any of these people. I will say that from Tim Kaine's own videos on the subject, he seems very enthusiastic about it. All of that to essentially say that all of the pieces are there. You can connect the dots from everything I've said in this video. If Microsoft wants to make this happen, they could make it happen. But again, that comes down to managing a few different things, provided the people involved want to actually make it, finding the dev resources to do so. Some of these people do technically work at different studios, which requires coordination, and they're all working on different projects. So, best case scenario, it would likely be a couple years before this even started development. But given that just a year or two ago this seemed literally impossible, and now, if the people involved want to, it could very much so become a reality, is an exciting prospect to me personally as somebody who loves CRPGs. I think it would be exceptionally cool. Now, I will say, personally, in terms of approaching this from a more corporate standpoint and gauging people's interest, whether this would be worth the money or investment of time, etc., I do think Microsoft has some options in that regard. I think very specifically, what they could do is update and release Arcanum as a sort of enhanced edition onto Game Pass that updates and makes it playable, incorporating a lot of things from the unofficial patch, maybe get that modder involved, that kind of thing. And that would allow them to simultaneously brush up an old game, bring it to Game Pass, where it could now actually get a bit of a second life, as this game is borderline unplayable these days without mods, etc., to get it running. And then they could use that as a metric to gauge interest by for a potential sequel. Because while something like BG3 is incredible to see, and I love that too, it's definitely more the exception than it is the rule, as most CRPGs just simply aren't that popular. So pouring a bunch of money into something that might just simply not be worth it still isn't going to fly from a corporate perspective. But I think doing something like offering an enhanced edition of Arcanum could be a useful way to, again, just sort of gauge general interest in something like that and help determine the amount of time and resources that should be allocated to it, if they wanted to do it. My point being that they have options for days here. And given how much of a cult classic that game is and how wonderful the world is, the fact that there's a sequel pitch basically ready to go means this is something I personally would love to see happen. I mean, hell, they could Kickstarter the thing and I'd back it. Not that a company of that size should ever be doing Kickstarters, to be clear, but you get my meaning. To sort of wrap this up, in keeping expectations realistic, I would say definitely don't get your hopes up until anything approaching an official announcement is made, as there are still just a ton of factors at play. And even in the absolute best case scenario, it would be several years away. But I can legitimately say now that it could in fact happen, which is really cool to me, and I hope they don't let the opportunity pass them by, provided, of course, it's something that the people working on it would want to do. Because as much as I think this would be a cool thing to happen, I will say here at the end, if any party involved in this is not fully committed to making it happen, you should just leave it alone. But if the passion is still there for it, then I would love to see it. And that is going to do it for today. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.